Welcome to I Just Don't Know, a podcast where I try to learn something new, challenge my opinions, and hope to make the misinformed informed. I can openly say I've spoken when I did not need to, been unnecessarily controversial, and shared my misinformed opinions thinking it was not. In this podcast, I'll try to right some wrongs and take on a new topic each episode that I think I knew, but in fact I just don't know. This episode is about myths, legends, and mystery, as well as imagination, romanticism, ancient Greeks, and ultimately the human race's fascination with the unknown, unproven, and the true past that eludes us. I will explore the fascinating story of the Lost City of Atlantis. I'm really excited about this episode. It's slightly different from all of the ones beforehand, but as soon as I sort of got my hooks into this topic, looking at a bit more of history, which is something I love anyway. You could argue this is a bit more pseudo-history, but this myth and legend of the Lost City of Atlantis is so fascinating. And when I was looking at some of the assumptions that I've made in the past, or what I thought about this great story, in reality, there is so much behind it that I cannot wait to just share with you guys and speak about the different origin stories, the different theories, the hypotheses of where Atlantis could be, and all the different influences over the years, over the decades, over the hundreds and hundreds of years. There is so much to this story that backs up why it is such a large part of the current sort of world of myths and legends. So really excited to share this one with you. Please do listen and find out a little bit more about the amazing, the fascinating Lost City of Atlantis. My first assumption, and what I first thought about the Lost City of Atlantis, probably goes back to a film that I remember going to the cinema for. Or we're looking back all the way 20 years to 2001, the great Disney film Atlantis, The Lost Empire. Looks like it came out around October time in 2001, and it was a great film, to be honest. It had the protagonist and main character Milo looking or trying to prove to the laughing scientific community that he has found or potentially found a door or way to the Lost City of Atlantis. And I remember the film really capturing my fascination as a young child, and loving the idea of this great civilization out there that is hidden away and running using technology that we couldn't even imagine. And so I think with that basis, I always thought Atlantis was a fictional story, a city somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. Great, maybe coming from the ideas of people when they travelled the oceans and the mystery of the unexplored depths of the Atlantic Ocean, that something is down there, and it's almost like an alien civilization or species that lives underwater, and that is what Atlantis is. And it's a fictional story of an advanced civilization doing that. So that was my first assumption, and that is a long way from what this real story is. There is so much more to it. So let's see how this goes. So the story of Atlantis is kicked off mostly by the well-known philosopher, ancient Greek Plato, the father and teacher of Aristotle, which I'm sure some of you have also heard of. But Plato, it all starts with him, and it goes back to his works, two famous works, they're called Timaeus and Critias. Hopefully that I'm pronouncing that right. But the first one is a dialogue by Timaeus, where he mentions an island, distant island, based on a story from a guy called Solon, who visited ancient Egypt in around 590, 580 BC. So considering that is around 150 years before Plato is around 440 BC to 350 BC. It's always debatable. But we're talking about something that is around 150 years before them, based on that story from Solon, who visited Egypt and found out something about this story. And so Timaeus, in his dialogue, doesn't really mention Atlantis specifically, but he does talk about a force, a mighty host from a distant point in the Atlantic Ocean that was looking to advance and attack the whole of Europe and all the way to Asia and as far as the eye could see into the east. And that there was an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules that supposedly is Cadiz, the south of Spain in the entry to the Mediterranean. Arguably, that could be the southern point of Greece, but we'll come on to that a bit later. But Timaeus suggests that there is this force and that based on an island larger than Libya and Asia together. So back then, that's probably sort of the Middle East and sort of North Africa. So that's a very large island. We'll come on to where that could be. But they are possible travelers from far away that are looking to conquer the Greek people, and they are more advanced, and they have a great and marvelous power that he says he held full sway over the island and many islands around it. So it's almost like an empire that he's talking about. And then we move on to, so that is sort of paraphrased by Plato in around 380 BC, of this idea that there is this perfect society that, well, actually no, the perfect society is actually Athens. And what Plato is trying to do here is that there is trying to highlight to the people of Athens that there is another civilization out there that is the opposite of them, but is a great threat to them. So that this civilization they are perhaps the antithesis of the perfect traits of the Republic and Athens itself, the perfect society. So therefore, it is a perfect opponent and antagonist against what Athens stands for. So that is actually potentially a motive there for Plato to try and explain and warn to the people of Athens that there is this threat out there and they have to protect what Plato stands for, the Republic itself. But let's move on to Critias, or Critias, if I'm saying that wrong. But according to Critias, he sort of builds on what Plato has used from Timaeus and adds a little bit more colour to it. And this is where it gets a little bit interesting here. So he says that Poseidon was given the island of Atlantis, and it was much larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined again, but it was later sunk by an earthquake that made it become impassable by a mud shoal to reach it and to reach the ocean completely. So therefore it just vanished. This entire civilization vanished. But according to Critias, it says that 9,000 years before Athens, so 9,000 BC you could say, he said that there was this great war between those who lived outside the Pillars of Hercules and those who lived within. So the Greeks, the people of sort of Libya and the modern day sort of Turkey and Middle East against these. And what happened there was that this great alliance led by Athens up against the Atlantean Empire fell apart, and Athens was left fighting on its own. So a little bit sort of sounds like it works out very nicely to make the Athenians look like the heroes here. But he is the person that outlined, as I mentioned before, that this empire was only conquered by nature itself, or he says because they fell out of favour with the deities, the gods at the time. And he said that There had occurred a violent earthquake and floods. In a single day and night of misfortune, all the warlike men sank to the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like a manner disappeared into the depths of the sea, for which reason the sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable. There is now a shoal of mud in the way, as caused by subsistence of the island. So the entire empire of the Atlantean Empire disappeared, and Poseidon's possession and his kingdom there that he ruled over was gone, and that's where the idea of the city disappearing, the civilization being lost forever into the sea. So that's where Critias comes in. So what is really interesting is in these two parts that Plato is presenting here. If you actually put it into a bit of a story, fundamentally is creating this enemy that the Athenians can think about and celebrate, that they repelled this external power. And that's always got me thinking that this always works in politics and civilizations. When you have an enemy, an other, it unites people. And it does seem like he is using this as a way of getting support for his philosophy and his way of thinking. And that's where it does get a little bit dubious about, okay, this is just a fictional story in order to make a philosophical point. And so it's interest from Plato there, whether that is true. But it goes a long way from here, and there's a lot of people that interpret this basis of the story of Atlantis, and it goes in lots of different directions as a result. So there is actually, interestingly, I didn't realize, an actual example of a civilization or city disappearing into the sea. And that was actually in 373 BC, so the time that Plato was talking about this story and this great legend or worry about this Atlantean people many thousand years ago, and using Solon's poem from Egypt as the basis of this great story. So going back to Solon, I didn't delve into him enough, but Solon basically supposedly went in 450 BC to Egypt and spoke to priests and traders, and they said of this great people that lived in the West to they didn't say West specifically, but they brought trade and brought this great empire over into in the Atlantic Ocean, or the ocean to the west. So that's where some of the inspiration could have come from for Plato to use this story in his writings and speech here. So, but the story of the actual city disappearing was Helic, which is near Corinth, in sort of the bay, the north, sort of in the middle of Greece. If you pointed right, it's slap bang in the middle where the sea sort of indents into Greece. Helic, spelled Helike. In 373 BC, was hit by a tsunami that completely engulfed the entire city. And there's a lot of evidence that from the Romans to the Greeks of ships and tourists and Romans exploring this great city by looking down, going into the ocean and exploring this great city. However, after many years, the silt of the sea just completely submerged the city, and for hundreds of years it was not discovered, and no one knew the actual location. And it was only very sort of recently, in the last sort of 100 or so years, that Helic was discovered and has become a world monument location about 15 years ago, and it's known to be near the city of Bora. And it can be, and the area below the city of Bora is where this city once stood. So there is more inspiration for Plato and this story about a submerged city that cannot be found, or proving that the gods can do this to a civilization or a city. So again, very, very curious and slightly suspicious, you could say, about the about where Plato is coming here. But there's other inspiration as well, and this is again more stories that I did not know about. So there was the Thera eruption, so modern day Santorini. You think about all the nice, beautiful white buildings and the people out having parties and cocktails and nice dinners and seafood. Well, actually, the Thera eruption was truly incredible, and I didn't even realize how this was so epic. So it was known as the Minoan Eruption, and it was around 1600 BC. So 1200 years before Plato is talking about it, and he doesn't refer to this necessarily, but there is possibility that the Egyptians of the time that could have inspired Plato and Solon's poem, etc., could have been inspired by this event. So in Santorini, right in the slap bang in the middle of the Aegean Sea, pretty much, there was a volcano that was on the magnitude scale of 6 and 7, considering 8 is the largest, and that's only ever happened millions of years ago and created the planet itself as we know it. But 7 is very, very rare, and we haven't had a 7 for hundreds and hundreds of years. But the Minoan eruption caused devastating effects, not just to the surrounding area, but it caused the whole world to cool. It caused, and if you think about the volcano in 1815 in Indonesia, it caused that I might talk about in another podcast. That was on a magnitude level 6. That caused a whole year where there was no summer. So imagine an eruption of that scale, where you could see a smoke trail up to the sky, all the way over in China almost. This, who knows, but it must have inspired incredible stories. But this idea that this entire island was just gone, completely changed, the whole landscape of that whole area was devastated. But then the next bit of inspiration that I think glues it all together, actually, was this famous story of the Sea Peoples. And again, I didn't really know much about this, but there was this great story and legend, and to be fair, potentially historically accurate Sea Peoples invasion. And the Sea Peoples invasion was a really interesting one. And this supposedly happened to sort of a federation of seafaring peoples attacked ancient Egypt and the whole of the eastern Mediterranean, so Greece and Turkey, between sort of 1200 to 900 BC. So about 500 years, 600 years before this that Plato is talking here. And so these sea peoples could have come from anywhere, really, but they sailed all around the eastern Mediterranean, invading and killing and pillaging the whole of that area, and they sort of potentially originated from all sorts of places, but they came through the Mediterranean of whatever it looked like, 3,000 years ago now, and caused absolute havoc. And this idea that this people from afar, that you don't know who they are, and they look different, behave different, have different cultures, can come at any moment and cause death and destruction to your civilization, and therefore you need to hold true your standards, your protection, what you truly believe in, just in case this happens. And this links back to what I said originally with Plato's story and his potential motives in that these sea peoples could come again, and this other civilization that is not us is a danger, and I can't tell you when they will come, but they might come. And there's a chance they will definitely come and fight you and take your homes. So, is this a motive to use as to try and unite the Athenian people against one ideal and his republic against this possible other, which has been done in politics many a time? But that is again up for debate. But I didn't really know much about this famous sea peoples, and they could have come supposedly from sort of Western Europe, sort of trying to get away from possible climate changes in sort of France and and Spain, or maybe they could have been people from the Azores or the western coast of Africa, or even they could have come from South America, and that's where we get onto it. So there is a chance, or there's a debate, that there is some that sort of, well, modern historians, and we're going to have to look at pseudo history in here. So this is not a proper historical accurate discussion. It's looking at possibilities, and there is the famous people back in sort of 500 years ago, which brought to life the story of Atlantis, was a well-known Francis Bacon in the 15th century, and he brought it to life. But there is a lot about how this story of Atlantis and the people of Atlantis is potentially related to the sort of Central American Mayan Empire and Aztec Empire. And there's possibility, try from the people once they discovered the Mayan people, the Aztecs in sort of the 16th century, the Renaissance period, these sort of savages, as they were calling them, and the sort of inherent fear and racism against the Central American people, the Native Americans of the time. They were so different from the Europeans, the Spanish who were there, the Portuguese, the English. They were trying to make sense of these peoples and their great temples, and you have in South America now, Central America and Mexico, Chichen Itza, and the Aztec temples and ruins that have been discovered. Can these savages and people who worship the sun be related, build these great things? Well, people are arguing no, they can't. And so they tried to make a story that these temples are the leftovers of this great civilization. And the idea of Atlantis was used again, that they are somehow a product of, or they were the sort of origin. They lived in sort of that Central American area, and they came to Europe and did all those things that Plato mentioned. So are the Mayan people related to it? But could they be related to it, or could they have just come down from the south and adopted these great temples? But the Europeans basically said the Mayan people were not capable of building these amazing structures. So that was the sort of, so it's a little bit coming from a bad place. Definitely coming from a bad place. But there was also discussion in more modern times, the idea that the Mayan people were very related to the Aztecs, as well as they're related to the Egyptians. Notably, they all worshipped the sun, or they had a sun god. And that commonality, while they're being so far away from each other, arguably, like they couldn't, very far away. How was that so similar? And the way they sort of depicted their gods and things like that. So the scholars here that were looking at this in the 19th century, sort of 1850s onwards, was Charles Etienne Brasseur de Bourbon. So Brasseur de Bourbon pops up quite a lot after this in the 1800s and brings this to life, as well as Edward Thompson in Britain. So this French scholar supposedly went around Mesoamerica, so this sort of Central American areas, and he translated lots of Mayan texts and looks at lots of sort of sacred areas. So he was there really hands-on, trying to make sense of these incredible people. And unfortunately, the Mayan people and Aztec people, the Native Americans of the Central America, many of them majority of them died from disease from Cortez and his conquistadors of the sort of 1650s and onwards, and before. So there weren't many people left, but these scholars 150 years ago, supposedly scholars, were just trying to make sense of it. And this is where the period of romanticism was kicking off in the 18th century, 19th century, where people were sort of renovating the ancient Greek sort of architecture, and people's fascination with the ancient past was coming back with vengeance, and this, so it fits in nicely with this period and this topical. It was very topical to I think the idea of this fantasy of this old world or this old civilization. So again, coming from a slightly skeptical view, you were just trying to make sense of it. But again, a part of me wants to say, well, there are pretty fascinating things over in Mexico and South America, and you could argue there's something going on there, and where does it sort of relate to? Where did they sort of get their origin from? What's their origin story? And we don't have very few bits of history from these peoples, because they didn't have the same records, and a lot of them obviously were killed, as we've just mentioned, as we know. So it's very difficult to know the origin stories of the Mayans and the Aztecs, these great civilizations in themselves, let alone Atlantis. So how are they related? And it did coincide with Heinrich Schliemann discovering supposedly the city of Troy, another epic poem of an ancient Greek, Homer, over in sort of the north west sort of area of modern day Turkey. So all this time, there's this idea of discovering the ancient worlds with potentially new technology, and the romanticism of the 19th century was taking hold. So a really interesting period for the story of Atlantis, but also that emerged into this thing and really came in as the defining, or as one of the defining factors of Atlantis and the story of Atlantis, was that it switched from being a people of the other and a people that is to be feared. It changes to the idea of utopia. And that came from Sir Thomas More in a 16th century work, so a little bit before this idea of the 19th century and the romanticism that it kicks it off again. But the idea that it is a utopia, a new world, and obviously that's linked to the discovery of America. So the whole idea of Atlantis definitely changes. It is no longer that idea that Plato used, or potentially fictional story or potential historically accurate story, depending on the different sort of students of Plato and interpretations of his work, to a idea that there is this perfect civilization out there, and it is the explanation of what was discovered in America. It's the explanation of the people of the Mayan Empire and the great temples that were discovered out there. And you can understand a little bit why that is, from a sense of trying to explain this great discovery of America. But overall, that switch was perhaps due to the just fascination of, as we go into the 19th century, with ancient traditions and ancient sort of architecture and ancient civilizations. Not only was the Romans and the Greeks getting a sort of a rebirth, but so was the great myth of Atlantis. And we're going to look next into how that goes on further into history now that we've covered the origins. But it's really interesting, some of these great moments in our ancient history that could have inspired this myth that I didn't even realize, and that Plato, while he could be argued as the original, sort of the origins of the city of the story of Atlantis, my feeling, he wasn't. There was so much potential inspiration for him, so many great stories that could have inspired him to create this myth or create this legend, or even talk about this historical event. Who knows? But there's so many interesting potential origin stories. But now we're going to move on to what's happened in perhaps the last 100 or so years and the location of Atlantis. Join me in part 2, where we'll continue this discussion and we'll try and find out where this lost city is.